The autumn of 1883 came early to the Powder River Valley in Wyoming Territory, riding in on a cold northwest wind that stripped the cottonwoods bare before October had barely settled in. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, stories of quiet strength and unexpected wisdom from those who built this land. And the story I share with you today begins on that wind, with a woman who had nothing but a hillside and the courage to trust it. She had arrived in the valley the previous spring with a wagon, 2 milk goats, a coil of rope, and exactly $11.40 to her name. 26 years old, with calloused hands and clear eyes the color of creek water after rain, she had filed her claim on 160 acres of sloped ground at the eastern edge of the valley. Land nobody else had wanted because the hills behind it were too steep for a plow and the soil too rocky for wheat. But she had looked at that hillside and seen something the others had not. Her cabin was small, 4 walls of rough-cut pine, a single window covered with oilcloth, a sod roof that leaked in heavy rain, and a door that swelled in the damp and required a firm shoulder to open. She had chinked the gaps between the logs herself, with river clay mixed with dry grass, working through the summer evenings until her fingers were raw. The cabin would keep her warm enough. The goats were another matter entirely. The 2 does, a pale cream one and a smaller brown one with cropped ears, had given her milk through the summer, and enough wool from their winter coats to card into yarn for trade. They were not simply livestock to her. They were income, insulation against hunger, her margin between scraping by and not managing at all. She needed them to survive the Wyoming winter, and a Wyoming winter was not a mild thing. It was a serious and sometimes violent thing, and a goat left without proper shelter would not last it. She had no money for timber. The nearest sawmill was 14 miles south, and even rough-cut pine planks cost more than she could put together before the first hard freeze. The other settlers in the valley had built their barns from lumber they had hauled across the plains, or from sod blocks cut from the low meadows near the creek. She had neither the materials nor the time to do either. So she looked at the hillside. The slope behind her cabin was a thick wall of packed earth and clay riddled with the roots of old grass and held firm by decades of undisturbed soil. It faced south, sheltered from the north wind by the ridge above. She had noticed, even in late summer, that the ground there stayed cool and damp several inches down, the kind of steady temperature that did not swing wild with the weather above. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. She picked up her spade on the second morning of October and began to dig. The neighbors noticed within the week. The first person to say something was the man who ran the trading post at the north end of the valley. He rode past on his way to check a fence line and pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of her property, watching her work from the saddle. She was knee-deep in the hillside by then, her spade turning up dark clay and thick slabs, her boots caked past the ankle. She did not stop digging when he called out to her. He wanted to know what she was doing. She told him she was making a shelter for her goats. He looked at the hole in the hill, then at the goats browsing along the fence, then back at the hole. He said something to himself that she could not quite hear and rode on without another word. She kept digging. By the end of the first week, she had carved out a space roughly 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a low ceiling she had to duck beneath. The walls were raw clay, dark and cool, streaked with thin roots and the occasional pale stone. She reinforced the ceiling with 3 stout poles she had salvaged from a collapsed fence row at the east edge of her claim, notching them in at either side and packing clay tightly around each one. The floor she leveled and covered with a thick layer of dry grass. It was not beautiful. It did not pretend to be. Word got around the settlement the way word always did in a valley with few people and long stretches of quiet. The story traveled from the trading post to the Hargrove family sod house, then to the 2 brothers who had claimed the creek bottom land, then to the Pedersen widow who kept chickens at the far south end of the valley. By the second week of October, she had received 3 visitors. None of them came to help. They came to look. They stood at the edge of her yard with polite expressions that barely covered something else. Amusement, mostly, and a little pity. One of the brothers said the earth would turn wet on her in the spring thaw and drown every animal she put in there. The Pedersen widow said nothing directly, but shook her head with the slow certainty of a woman who believed she had seen enough of the world to know what worked and what did not. Only the eldest Hargrove girl, who was perhaps 19 and had said little in her family's presence, hung back at the fence a moment longer and studied the opening in the hillside with something that looked almost like genuine curiosity. She noticed that. She did not argue with any of them. She thanked them for stopping and returned to her work. There was still the matter of drainage. The clay held moisture well, which was its virtue, but rain or snowmelt running down the slope could pool on the floor and make the whole pen miserable. She had been turning that problem over in her mind for 3 days, and she thought she had the beginning of an answer. The answer had come to her the way most useful things did, not from a book or another person's advice, but from watching water move. She had spent an afternoon 2 weeks earlier crouched at the low end of the hillside after a hard rain, watching the runoff find its own path. It did not move evenly. It gathered in small channels following the lowest ground, threading between stones, always choosing the easiest route downhill. She had watched it long enough to understand exactly where it wanted to go, and once she understood that, she knew how to persuade it. Over 3 days, she dug a shallow trench along the uphill face of the pen just outside the entrance, angled slightly so that it cut across the natural slope and carried water sideways rather than down. The trench was not deep, 4 inches, perhaps 5 at the deepest, but it did not need to be deep. It needed only to interrupt the sheet of water before it reached her doorway. She lined the bottom of it with the flat stones she had pulled from the excavation, setting them close and tight so the channel held its shape without washing out. Then she turned to the floor inside. The clay she had removed was dense and gray-blue, good for holding shape, but the floor she had left behind was uneven from her digging. She spent the better part of a day smoothing it, tamping it down in sections with a flat-bottomed post she had cut for the purpose. Where the floor sloped toward the back wall, she built it up with packed earth and tamped it smooth again until the entire surface ran very slightly downhill toward the entrance, perhaps a 1/4 inch of drop for every foot of length. Nothing that would trouble an animal's footing, just enough that any moisture finding its way inside would be coaxed outward rather than left to pool. She cut a small secondary drain channel in the floor itself, no wider than her hand, running straight down the middle from back to entrance, and packed its sides tight. At the entrance, she set 2 flat stones flush with the ground, slightly lower than the surrounding earth, so that the channel had somewhere to empty into before the water reached her outer trench and was carried off sideways down the hill. It was not a complicated system. A child who understood how water moved could have made sense of it. But it was careful work, and she did it carefully, because careful work done once was better than repair work done endlessly. When she poured a bucket of water onto the back of the floor to test it, she stood at the entrance and watched the thin sheet of it find the center channel and travel, slow and even, toward the stones at the door. It took longer than she expected. She poured a second bucket. By the time it reached the flat stones, the first had already emptied down the slope beyond the entrance and vanished into the ground. She straightened and allowed herself a single quiet moment of satisfaction before picking up the bucket again. The drainage solved one problem. She turned her attention next to the walls. The hillside clay was dense and held its shape well, but bare earth sweated in the warm seasons and crumbled at the surface when it dried too fast. She needed to do something about the lower 2 feet of wall, the section the animals would press against all winter long. She had no lime, no plaster, no lumber to spare for proper planking. What she had was time and a pile of flat shale she had pulled from the creek bank over the past several weeks. She spent 3 mornings fitting the shale pieces against the lower walls like a dry mosaic, wedging the flatter stones tight and packing the gaps with clay pressed in by her fingers. It was slow, deliberate work. Her hands ached by midday. She soaked them in creek water and went back. The shale would not rot, would not absorb moisture the way bare earth did, and the animals could lean on it without wearing the wall down to nothing by spring. It also held a certain coolness in summer and a certain warmth in winter, the way stone always did. slow to change, reluctant to give up what it had gathered. When she stepped back and looked at what she had built, she felt something she had not expected. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. The recognition that the thing in front of her was good, and that good things came from sustained attention and not from hurrying. She was tamping the last gap with the heel of her hand when she heard voices on the road above. Two women from the settlement passing on their way toward the trading post. She could not make out the words at first, only the tone, that particular pitch of amusement that does not bother to lower itself because it does not expect to be called to account. Then she caught a phrase, something about a hole in the hill, something about a woman living no better than a groundhog. One of them laughed. And the laughter carried clean and easy across the cold air, the way sound always did before a weather change. She did not straighten up. She did not call out. She pressed her palm flat against the shale wall and felt the faint, cool solidity of it, the patience of stone. And she stayed exactly where she was until the voices passed and the road above her went quiet again. Then she reached for her trowel and kept working. The trowel's scrape, a steady rhythm against the stone. She had learned over the weeks of this work that rhythm was its own kind of answer. Not to the women on the road, not to the settlement's opinion of what a woman's homestead ought to look like, but to the problem directly in front of her hands. The problem was always specific. A gap here, a loose stone there, the way water would find the lowest seam if you gave it any invitation at all. She concentrated on the specific and let the rest dissolve. The entrance tunnel needed another day of work before she could properly frame the door. She had salvaged planks from a collapsed feed shed on the eastern edge of her claim. Wood too weathered for much else, she finished the door on the fourth afternoon, working by the thin light that angled through the cottonwoods along the creek. The planks she had salvaged from the collapsed feed shed were warped in places and split at the ends, but she had soaked them in water overnight and weighted them flat with stones, and by morning they had taken a shape she could work with. She cut them to length with a handsaw that needed sharpening, measured the opening 3 times before she made the first cut, and fastened them together with crossbars she had split from a fallen pine. The hinges were made from an old harness strap she had soaked in tallow until the leather softened, then folded and nailed into place. They were not elegant hinges. They would not swing smooth and silent the way iron hinges did in a proper carpenter's shop, but they would hold, and they would bend without breaking, and that was enough. She hung the door and tested it from both sides. It swung inward with a low scrape against the threshold stone, settled into its frame with a solid thump, and held there without needing a latch. She adjusted the leather straps by 1 notch on the upper hinge, tested it again, and nodded once to herself. Then she went inside and began moving the straw deeper into the chamber, building a thick bed along the back wall where the warmth would settle. The goats watched her from the entrance, their heads tilted, their jaws working in that slow, circular motion that meant nothing and everything. She spoke to them in a low voice as she worked, the kind of running commentary that a person living alone develops without noticing. "You'll get used to the dark in here," she said, smoothing a clump of straw into place. "It stays warmer than the light. You'll see." The cream dough stepped forward and sniffed at the fresh bedding, then sneezed and backed away. She laughed, a short, quiet sound, and kept working. The move took place the following morning. She led them one by one through the tunnel, carrying the youngest kid in the crook of her arm, and settled them into the deep straw. They stood together in a tight cluster at first, ears swiveling, testing the new acoustics of the space, the way the low ceiling pressed the sound of their own breathing back at them. Then the cream dough lowered her head and began to nibble at a loose stem of hay, and one by one the others followed her lead. By midday they were lying down. She sat in the entrance for a while, watching them, feeling the still air against her face. It was not warm by any ordinary standard, but it was not cold either. It was the temperature of the earth itself, patient and steady, and she knew she had built something true. The valley took notice of the finished shelter within a matter of days. It happened the way news always traveled in a place with few roads and fewer diversions. Someone saw the door fitted into the hillside and told someone else, and by the following week, the story had grown its own shape. She heard fragments of it when she went to the trading post for salt and coffee. The widow Pedersen was there, standing by the counter with a sack of cornmeal in her arms, and she gave the woman a look that was not quite a greeting and said to the postkeeper in a carrying voice, "I hear she's got her goats living in a hole in the ground now, like a badger." The postkeeper, a man named Ezra Trumbull, said nothing. He weighed the salt and slid it across the counter without meeting her eyes. But she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, and she understood what that meant. The brothers who farmed the creek bottom, Caleb and Josiah Calloway, were the ones who made it their business to spread the joke. They stopped at her fence line one afternoon when she was hauling water from the creek, and Caleb called out to her, "You living in that hole yet yourself, or just the goats?" Josiah laughed, a hard, flat sound that bounced off the hillside. She set the bucket down and walked over to the fence. She looked at Caleb for a long moment, not with anger, but with the kind of steady attention that makes a person feel seen in a way they did not ask for. "The goats are settled fine," she said. "They don't seem to mind the dark." Caleb's grin faltered. He had expected her to defend herself or to shrink away. She did neither. She picked the bucket back up and walked to the cabin without hurrying. She heard Josiah say something low and mocking behind her, but she did not turn around. Winter came on in stages that year. The first frost arrived in late October, a hard white crust that silvered the grass and turned the mud in the yard to iron. She banked the cabin with sod and straw, piling it high against the foundation logs where the drafts crept through. She cut and stacked an extra cord of wood, working until her arms ached and the blisters on her palms broke and calloused over. She did not have a man to help her, and she did not expect one. The work was hers to do, and she did it. It was around this time that she met the eldest Hargrove girl again. The girl appeared at her gate one gray afternoon, a thin figure in a coat too large for her, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She said her name was Martha Hargrove, and she had brought eggs. Her mother had sent them, she said, though the way she said it made the woman suspect the girl had come on her own errand. She invited her in, and Martha sat at the table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, looking around the small cabin with frank curiosity. She asked about the hillside shelter. She asked how deep it went, whether the walls stayed dry, whether the goats seemed content. The woman answered each question plainly, and when she finished, Martha was quiet for a long moment. "I told my father about it," Martha said finally. "He said it would collapse come spring." She looked down at her cup. "But I don't think he's ever dug into a hillside before." The woman did not say anything to that. She simply nodded and let the silence settle. By mid-November, the hillside pen had become a quiet rumor of something stranger than a joke. It was not quite respect, she sensed, but the absence of outright mockery. The Calloway brothers still made their comments when they passed, but the comments had grown thinner, less certain, as though the joke was wearing out from overuse. Ezra Trumbull had stopped smiling when her name came up. She noticed these things the way she noticed the shift in wind direction before a weather change. She did not act on them. She simply filed them away in the quiet ledger of her mind, alongside the knowledge of which seeds sprouted best in rocky soil, and which stretches of fence line needed mending before the snow came. The snow came on the last day of November. It came without warning, the way winter storms often did on the high plains, arriving not as a gradual accumulation, but as a wall of white that seemed to drop from the sky all at once. She was inside the cabin when it hit, mending a tear in her wool shirt, and the sound of it against the north wall made her look up sharply. It was not the sound of snow falling. It was the sound of snow being driven by wind that had traveled a long distance without anything to stop it. She set the mending aside and went to the door. The world outside had vanished. There was no horizon, no tree line, no fence. There was only white, moving fast and thick, and the wind that carried it. She closed the door and latched it, then stood with her hand on the latch, listening to the storm build against the cabin. The temperature dropped as she stood there. She could feel it seeping through the floorboards, through the cracks she had chinked and re-chinked, finding its way in with the persistence of something that had nowhere else to go. She built up the fire and went through the passage to the hillside pen. The goats were calm. They had arranged themselves in the deep straw, pressed together for warmth, and the air in the chamber was still and breathable. She checked the ventilation gap, felt the faint trickle of cold air coming through the burlap, and adjusted the layers to slow it further. The earth walls held the warmth the way she had known they would. She sat down among the goats for a while, her back against the shale-lined wall, listening to the storm rage above her. The sound was muffled here, reduced to a low thrumming that vibrated through the hillside itself. She closed her eyes and let herself rest. The storm lasted 3 days. She lost count of the hours, measuring time only by the firewood she burned and the water she melted. She went to the pen every few hours to check the goats, to add hay, to break the ice that formed on the water trough despite the shelter's warmth. On the second day, she heard a crack from somewhere above the cabin. A tree limb falling, or a roof timber giving way under the weight of snow. She did not go out to investigate. There was nothing she could do about it until the storm passed, and going out in that white blindness was a risk she would not take for something that could wait. On the third morning, the wind stopped. She noticed it first as an absence, a silence so sudden it felt like a presence. She sat up in her chair, the quilt falling from her shoulders, and listened. Nothing. No howl, no shudder, no relentless pressure against the walls. She stood and went to the door, pushed it open against the drift that had piled against it. The snow was up to her waist on the sheltered side, deeper on the north. She dug a path to the pen entrance, cleared the door, and went inside. The goats were standing, all of them, on their feet, blinking at her in the dim light. The cream doe came forward and pressed her nose against the woman's coat, and she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She spent the rest of that day digging out, clearing the cabin door, the path to the woodpile, the trench she had dug for drainage. The world was transformed, smoothed and rounded, every sharp edge buried under a depth of white that softened the whole valley into something unrecognizable. She worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of her shovel and the occasional creak of snow settling under its own weight. She did not see another person that day. The valley was buried, and the people in it were buried with their animals, waiting for someone to come through the drifts. She was the one who came through. Not because she was stronger or braver, but because she had built differently, and the difference had made all the distance between surviving and not. On the fourth morning, she strapped on the snowshoes she had made from willow branches and rawhide the previous winter, and she walked down to the valley floor to see what the storm had done. Picture her there, moving across that white silence, a single figure in a vast landscape, the hillside behind her holding its warmth like a secret, and the road ahead leading into the aftermath of something that had not yet been measured. She did not know what she would find. She only knew that the earth had kept faith with her, and that she would need to keep faith with whatever came next. She did not know what she would find. She only knew that the earth had kept faith with her, and that she would need to keep faith with whatever came next. The snowshoes creaked beneath her as she moved down the slope, the willow frames settling into the crust with a sound like footsteps on dry bread. The world was still and white and so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a steady rhythm that matched the slow push of her legs through the drifts. She passed the fence line that marked the eastern edge of her claim, the top rail barely visible above the snow, and she crossed onto the road that led toward the valley floor. The road was not a road anymore. It was a white ribbon that followed the low ground, indistinguishable from the fields on either side, marked only by the occasional fence post that stuck up like a broken tooth. The first homestead she reached was the Hargrove place. The sod house stood low against the drifts, its roof bowed under the weight of snow that had not been cleared. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, wavering column, which told her the family was alive. She knocked on the door and waited. It opened a crack, and old Mr. Hargrove peered out at her, his eyes squinting against the brightness. He looked at her snowshoes, at the pack on her back, at the steady way she stood in the cold. "You made it through," he said. It was not a question. "My goats are fine," she said. "I came to see if you needed anything." He stared at her for a long moment, then opened the door wider. Behind him, his wife was bundling children near the hearth. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The fire was small, fed with green wood that hissed and smoked. She saw the problem immediately. Their fuel was wet, and they were rationing what little dry wood they had left. She told him she had an axe and a dry cache of split pine under the eaves of her cabin. He shook his head. "The road is gone. "You cannot haul wood through this." She said nothing. She simply turned and walked back into the white silence, and she spent the rest of that day breaking a trail between the Hargrove place and her own woodpile, carrying split logs on her back, one load at a time, until her shoulders screamed and her breath came in short white bursts. She did not stop until the Hargrove woodpile was higher than it had been before the storm. She did the same for the Pratt family the next day. Their chicken coop had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and they had lost half their flock. The surviving birds were huddled in the corner of the soddy, pecking at the dirt floor, and the family was eating boiled potatoes for the third day in a row. She did not mention her goats. She did not mention the hillside shelter that had held warm and dry through the worst of it. She simply set to work helping them clear the coop debris, salvage what they could, and shore up the remaining wall. Mrs. Pratt, a thin woman with red hands and a tired mouth, watched her work and said, "I heard what you built, the hole in the hill." The woman paused, a broken board in her hands. "I did not laugh," Mrs. Pratt said quietly. "I did not think it was funny." She nodded once and kept working. The Calloway brothers were a different matter. She found their place on the third day of her rounds, a quarter-mile down the creek bottom, where the land flattened into a broad meadow. The barn was gone, not damaged, not leaning. Gone. The roof had caved in completely, and the walls had buckled outward, spilling hay and broken timbers across the yard like the bones of some enormous animal. Caleb Calloway stood in the middle of the wreckage, a crowbar in his hand, his face a mask of exhaustion and rage. His brother Josiah was on his knees, pulling at a piece of planking that had pinned something underneath. She saw a hoof, still and dark, protruding from the debris. She stopped at the edge of the yard and called out. Caleb looked up, and when he saw her, something flickered across his face. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was the hard, flat look of a man who had been caught in a moment of weakness and resented being seen. "What do you want?" he said. She told him she had come to help. She told him her shelter had survived, that she had extra hay, that her goats were giving milk, that she could spare a few gallons for his family if they needed it. Caleb stared at her, the crowbar hanging loose in his hand. Josiah looked up from the debris, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "We do not need your charity," Caleb said. "We do not need a woman who lives in a cave coming down here to gloat." She did not flinch. "I am not gloating," she said. "I am offering." He said something under his breath, something she did not catch, and turned back to the wreckage. She stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away. The widow Pedersen was at the trading post when she stopped for coffee the following week. Ezra Trumbull had managed to dig a path to his door, and a handful of settlers had gathered, stamping snow from their boots, trading news in low voices. The widow was holding court near the stove, a cup of tea in her hand, her voice carrying the way voices do when the speaker intends to be heard. "She has been going from place to place," the widow was saying, "offering milk and hay like she is the only one who thought to prepare. You would think she had built a fortress instead of a hole in the dirt." A few of the men around her nodded, their faces unreadable. The widow went on. "It is not natural, that shelter of hers. I have never heard of a hillside staying warm through a storm like that. I am not saying it is witchcraft, but I am not saying it is not." There was a murmur, a shifting of feet. She stood in the doorway, her hand on the latch, and looked at the widow across the room. The widow had not noticed her yet. She considered saying something. She considered walking up to the stove and standing there, letting the widow see her, letting the words fall where they might. But she had learned that arguing with people who had already made up their minds was like fighting the wind. You exhausted yourself and changed nothing. So she stepped back out into the cold and let the door swing shut behind her. The weather held cold through December and into January. The snow did not melt. It compacted and crystallized, turning into a hard, wind-scoured crust that made travel possible but brutal. She made the trip to the trading post every 10 days, trading goat milk and wool yarn for coffee, salt, and the occasional sack of grain. The goats were thriving. The cream doe had given birth to a single kid in early January, a sturdy little buck with a white star on his forehead, and the milk yield had increased. She was careful with her resources, measuring every portion, wasting nothing. She had learned that lesson the hard way in her first winter on the plains, and she did not need to learn it again. The mockery did not end, but it changed shape. It became quieter, more pointed, the kind of talk that happened in corners and behind hands. She heard fragments of it when she went to the post. Someone said she had made a pact with something. Someone said the hillside was not natural, that the earth did not hold heat that way without assistance of a kind no honest person would seek. She heard that her goats were not ordinary goats, that they had been chosen for some purpose no one could name. She listened to all of it without responding, and she went home to her hillside and her animals and her small, steady life. But the talk was having an effect. She noticed it in the way people avoided her gaze at the trading post, in the way the Pratt family, who had accepted her help, now seemed to look away when she passed, in the way Mrs. Hargrove, who had pressed a jar of preserves into her hands with real gratitude, now sent her daughter Martha with the eggs instead of bringing them herself. Martha was the only one who still met her eyes directly. The girl came to the cabin one afternoon in late January, ostensibly to return a tin cup she had borrowed. But she stayed for nearly an hour, sitting on the stool by the fire, asking questions about the goats, about the hillside, about how she had known to build it that way. And then, in a lower voice, Martha said, "My father told me not to come here. He said it is causing talk." She looked at the girl, at her earnest, worried face, and she felt something give way inside her. Not much, but enough to make her voice softer than she had intended. "What kind of talk?" The girl hesitated. "That you are not like the rest of us. That you have ways we do not understand. That the hillside should not work the way it does." She let the silence stretch, then shook her head slowly. "It works because I built it that way," she said. "That is all. I watched the water. I watched the cold. I let the earth tell me what it needed." Martha looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and left without another word. That night she sat by the fire and thought about the talk. She thought about the widow Pedersen, spreading her whispers like seeds in a summer field. She thought about the Calloway brothers, who had lost everything in the storm and could not bear to see someone who had not. She thought about the families she had helped, who now kept their distance for fear of being tainted by association. She thought about Martha Hargrove, who had come anyway. And she thought about the hillside, about the warmth it held, about the 8 goats that had not lost a single kid, about the milk that had fed her and would feed her through the rest of the winter. She understood that she had done something the settlement could not explain, and that what people cannot explain they either revere or resent. She had not expected reverence. She had not asked for it. But the resentment was a living thing now, growing in the cold, and she could feel it pressing against her the way the wind pressed against her walls. In early February, a delegation came to her door. 3 men, Ezra Trumbull from the trading post, old Mr. Hargrove, and a man she recognized as the county assessor, a thin, precise man in a tall hat who had come through the valley the previous summer to file claims. They stood in her yard, their breath hanging in the air, and they told her that the settlement had concerns. The assessor spoke first, his voice carrying the official weight of a man who had read too many documents and not enough skies. He said there had been questions about the safety of her structure, about whether it violated any regulations regarding dwelling construction, about whether a hillside excavation could be considered a lawful improvement. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at Ezra Trumbull, who would not meet her eyes. Then she looked at old Mr. Hargrove, whose face was a mixture of embarrassment and something else she could not name. "The structure is sound," she said. "It has passed the winter without a single crack. The ventilation is adequate. The temperature stays above freezing even in the worst weather. You are welcome to inspect it." The assessor hesitated. "We would need to see it," he said. "We would need to verify that it meets the standards for a livestock shelter on a homestead claim." She stepped aside and gestured toward the passage. "I have nothing to hide," she said. They followed her into the hillside. She watched their faces as they stepped through the low door, as the warmth hit them, as the smell of clean hay and healthy animals filled the air. The goats were standing, all 8 of them, their eyes calm, their coats clean and full. The walls were dry, the floor was dry. The ventilation gap let in a trickle of cold air that kept the atmosphere fresh without draining the heat. The assessor walked the length of the chamber, running his hand along the shale lining, tapping the timber supports, checking the corner where the clay was packed tight. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he turned to her, and his expression had changed. It was not warm, it was not friendly, but it was no longer officious. It was the face of a man who had expected to find a shoddy, dangerous thing, and had found instead a piece of work that surpassed anything he had seen in the valley. "This is not a hole in the ground," he said quietly. "This is a properly constructed earth shelter with sound drainage and adequate support." He looked at Ezra Trumbull. "It is better than half the barns I have inspected in this county." Ezra said nothing. Old Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat. "We just wanted to be sure," he mumbled. The talk got out of hand. She did not answer him. She looked at the assessor, whose pen was hovering over a form. "You will note it as a lawful improvement?" she asked. He nodded once, curtly, and made a mark on the paper. The delegation left without another word, filing out of the hillside into the white afternoon, and she stood in the entrance and watched them go. She thought the matter was settled, but the talk did not stop. It moved underground, the way water moves through clay, invisible until it surfaces somewhere you did not expect. She felt it in the trade prices at the post, where Ezra Trumbull suddenly charged her a penny more per pound for coffee, claiming the freight rates had gone up. She felt it in the silences that fell when she entered the post, the way conversations broke off and resumed on a different topic. She felt it in the small things. A strand of her fence cut one morning, a rock thrown through the oilcloth in her window, the familiar cream dough found standing in the yard with a shallow cut on her flank, something that could have been a rock or a piece of glass. She did not report any of it. There was no one to report it to. She simply repaired the fence, patched the window, cleaned the dough's wound with salt water, and watched the horizon with a new kind of attention. And then the weather changed again. A warm spell came in mid-February, a fall spring that melted the top layer of snow into a wet, heavy slush that soaked into the ground and froze again at night. The runoff cut gullies across the road, loosened the soil on the hillsides, sent water streaming into places it had not been all winter. She checked her drainage channels daily, clearing debris, ensuring the water found its way around rather than through her shelter. She watched the hillside with a practiced eye, reading the subtle shifts in the way the earth held its shape. Something was coming. She did not know what, but she knew the ground was changing, and she knew that the people in the valley who had built on flat land and trusted the frost to hold them steady were about to learn a lesson the earth had been waiting to teach. She went to sleep on the night of February 17th with the sound of dripping water ticking against the eaves, and she woke in the darkness to a different sound entirely. A low, grinding rumble that came from somewhere deep in the valley, followed by a human cry, thin and distant, carried on the wind. She lay still for a moment, her heart beating hard, and then she rose and dressed in the dark and went out into the night to find out what had broken. She pulled on her coat and boots in the dark, her fingers finding the laces by memory, the familiar motions of a woman who dressed in the dark more often than she dressed in the light. She took the lantern from its hook by the door, but did not light it yet. The moon was 3/4 full, riding high through a break in the clouds, and the snow-covered valley caught that silver light and held it, reflecting every shadow in sharp blue-white contrast. She could see well enough to walk. She stepped outside and stood still, listening. The sound had come from the south, from the direction of the creek where the land dipped into a shallow basin. It was not repeated, but the silence that followed had a different quality than ordinary silence. It was the silence of something that had just happened, a held breath after a fall. She crossed the yard and started down the slope toward the valley floor, the snowshoes hissing over the crust. The temperature had risen above freezing sometime in the night, and the top layer of snow was wet and heavy, clinging to her frames with each step. Water ran in rivulets beneath the crust, cutting channels that she could hear but not see. The ground was waking up. She moved faster. As she reached the bottom of the slope and turned onto the road that followed the creek, she saw the first sign of trouble. The road was gone. Not buried, gone. A wide gash of bare earth and broken rock had cut across it at a diagonal, carrying away the packed snow and the frozen ground beneath it. The gash was perhaps 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep, raw and fresh, with water still seeping from the exposed layers of soil. A mudslide. The thaw had loosened the hillside above the road, and the whole face had let go in a single, slow, catastrophic motion. She followed the edge of the slide downstream, picking her way around the debris. The creek was running high, swollen with meltwater, and it had undercut the banks in several places, toppling trees and washing out fence lines. She saw a piece of a barn wall wedged against a cottonwood, the boards splintered and twisted. She saw a water barrel spinning in the current. She saw a dark shape in the mud at the edge of the slide and stopped. It was a cow, lying on its side, unmoving. She did not go closer. There was nothing to be done for it. She continued down the creek until she came to the bend where the Calloway brothers had their place. The barn was gone, again, but this time it had not collapsed under snow. It had been hit by the slide, pushed off its foundation, carried partway down the slope, and left in a heap of broken timber and mud that bore almost no resemblance to a structure. The house was still standing, but the front wall was covered in mud up to the windows, and the door was jammed. She called out. No answer. She called again, louder, and after a moment the door scraped open a few inches, and Caleb Calloway's face appeared in the gap. He looked older than he had a month ago. His eyes were dark-ringed, his skin gray in the moonlight. "Lost the barn again," he said. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. "Lost 4 head this time, the milk cow and 3 yearlings." He said it the way a man reports the weather. She asked if anyone was hurt. He shook his head. "Josiah's leg got pinned for a while, but he's free now. He's inside. Bruised up, but nothing broke." She nodded and asked if they needed food or shelter for the remaining animals. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head again. "We'll manage," he said. "We always do." But his voice cracked on the last word, and she heard what he did not say. She turned and left without pressing him. The slide had damaged 3 other homesteads along the creek. The Pratt place had lost their root cellar, buried under 6 feet of mud. Mrs. Pratt was standing in the yard with a shovel, trying to dig down to the stored vegetables, her youngest child wrapped in a blanket and crying in a monotonous, exhausted wail. She joined Mrs. Pratt with her own shovel, and they worked side by side for nearly an hour, scooping mud in the dark, until they reached the cellar door. The vegetables inside were ruined. The mud had found every seam, and the potatoes and turnips were coated in a thick, gritty paste that could not be washed clean enough to save. Mrs. Pratt sat down on the ground, her face empty, and the child's crying seemed to grow louder in the sudden stillness. She put a hand on Mrs. Pratt's shoulder and said, "I have dried beans and a few jars of preserved squash in the root cellar. You are welcome to them." Mrs. Pratt looked up at her, and for a moment her eyes were full of something hard and proud. Then the hard thing cracked, and she nodded, and the woman helped her to her feet and walked her back to the house. By dawn, the full extent of the damage was visible. The warm spell had triggered a series of slides and washouts all along the hillsides that bordered the valley floor. 3 more homesteads reported losses. The road to the trading post was cut in 2 places, impassable even on foot. The creek had risen another 2 feet overnight and was threatening the low-lying fields where the Calloway brothers had planned to plant corn in the spring. The entire valley was waking up to the reality that the ground they had trusted had shifted under them, and nothing they had built on the flat land had been designed for this. She returned to her own homestead as the sun rose, exhausted and cold, her coat caked with mud and her hands numb inside her gloves. She went first to the hillside pen. The goats were calm, the chamber dry. She checked the drainage channels and found them working exactly as she had designed, carrying the meltwater in a shallow, steady stream, away from the entrance and down the hillside in a controlled path. Not a single drop had seeped through the packed earth or the shale lining. She leaned against the wall of the tunnel and let herself breathe. The hillside had held. That evening, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Martha Hargrove standing on the step, her face pale and streaked with tears. "My father sent me," Martha said. "The slide took our chicken coop. We lost 23 birds, and the well is full of mud. We cannot get water." She stood aside and let the girl in. She poured her a cup of tea, wrapped her in a blanket, and told her that she would come in the morning with buckets and a clean place to draw water from the spring above the hillside. Martha nodded, sipping the tea, and then she said, "My father told me to ask you if the goats are still all right." She paused. He never asked about them before. She looked at the girl and understood that something had shifted in the valley. The crisis was not over. The thaw had only begun, and more slides were possible, more washouts, more days of mud and cold and hunger. But in the middle of that uncertainty, her hillside stood steady, and the people who had mocked her were beginning to turn their eyes toward her with a new kind of attention. It was not yet respect, it was not yet gratitude. It was the slow, reluctant recognition that the woman they had laughed at had seen something they had missed. And that recognition, for now, was enough. She woke before dawn the next morning, her body aching from the previous day's labor, and built the fire with wood she had split and stacked in the dry corner of the cabin. The coffee was down to the last handful of beans, and she ground them carefully, measuring each one, knowing she would need to stretch them until the road cleared enough for a trip to the trading post. She drank her coffee standing at the window, watching the gray light creep over the hillside. The mud had frozen overnight. The temperature had dropped again, not to the bitter cold of January, but enough to turn the surface of the wet ground into a hard, treacherous crust that would break under weight and cut a person's boots to pieces. The thaw was not finished, though. She could feel it in the air, a dampness that sat beneath the cold, waiting. Another warm spell would come, and when it did, the ground would soften again, and more hillsides would let go. She pulled on her coat and went out to check the pen. The goats were stirring, the cream doe standing at the low door, bleating softly. The kid was nursing. The others were lying in the deep straw, their eyes half closed, their breath rising in gentle clouds that drifted toward the ventilation gap. The chamber was dry. The shale walls glistened faintly with condensation, but the floor was clean, and the drainage channel ran clear. She added fresh hay, filled the water trough from the barrel she kept inside, and stood for a moment listening to the quiet sounds of animals at ease. Then she went out to begin the day's work. She spent the morning hauling water from the spring to the Hargrove place, carrying 2 buckets at a time, walking slowly over the frozen crust. The spring emerged from a crevice in the hillside a quarter-mile above her cabin, a thin, steady trickle that had never frozen, even in the coldest winters. She had known about it since her first summer on the claim, had followed the faint path of damp ground uphill until she found the source. She had not told anyone about it, not out of secrecy, but because it had not occurred to her that it was information worth sharing. Now she carried the water down to the Hargrove well and poured it in, bucket after bucket, until the mud had thinned enough to pump clean. Old Mr. Hargrove stood at the door of the soddy, watching her, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He did not thank her, but when she finished and turned to leave, he said, "You can take some eggs if you want. The chickens that survived are laying again." She nodded and took 4 eggs, wrapped in a cloth, and walked back up the hill. The widow Petterson's place was next. She had not intended to stop there. The widow had made her feelings clear, and the woman had no interest in forcing her help where it was not wanted. But the path to the trading post took her past the widow's gate, and she could not help noticing that the chicken coop was listing badly, its north wall pushed inward by the weight of the snow and mud. The widow was outside, trying to prop the wall with a length of 2x4, her thin arms straining. She stopped. She stood at the fence for a moment, then called out, "Do you need a hand?" The widow did not turn around. "I do not need anything from you," she said, her voice tight with effort. The woman nodded, turned, and continued walking. But she did not go far. She stopped at the bend in the road, where the widow could not see her, and she waited. If the widow could not ask for help, she could at least make herself available if the need became too great. It was not charity she offered. It was presence. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through her boots, listening to the grunt and scrape of the widow's labor. Finally, there was a crack, a muffled curse, and then silence. She walked back. The widow was standing in the yard, the 2x4 snapped in her hands, her face a mixture of fury and defeat. She said nothing. The woman stepped through the gate, picked up the broken board, and began to examine the damage to the coop wall. The widow watched her work. She did not help. She did not leave. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted, her pride wrapped around her like a shield that had too many holes to keep anything out. The woman worked for an hour, bracing the wall with salvaged timber, clearing the mud that had piled against the base, creating a channel for water to drain away from the structure. When she finished, she picked up her empty water bucket and walked to the gate. The widow said nothing. But as she passed, the widow's voice came, thin and reluctant. "The road to the post is cut in 2 places. Ezra says it will be a week before he can get a wagon through." She stopped. "I know," she said. Then she added, "I have extra beans, and the goat is milking well." The widow was silent. She did not turn around to see her face. She simply walked on, leaving the offer hanging in the cold air like a thread that might be taken or might fray away. The days that followed were a slow, grinding struggle. The warm spell returned on the 3rd day, bringing rain that turned the frozen crust back into mud and sent new streams of water cutting across the roads. Another slide came down on the east side of the valley, burying the Peterson family's root cellar and taking out a section of fence that had held their remaining milk cow. The cow was found wandering the road, shivering and cut along its flank, and the woman brought it to her hillside pen, leading it slowly up the slope, talking to it in a low, steady voice. She did not ask permission. She simply did what needed doing. The cow fit in the pen alongside the goats, crowding them somewhat, but the chamber was large enough, and the goats adjusted. The cow lay down in the straw and closed its eyes, and she leaned against the wall and watched it breathe. Word spread. The Calloway brothers heard that she had taken in the Peterson cow, and Caleb Calloway walked up to her property the following afternoon, picking his way over the muddy ground, his boots caked to the knees. He stopped at the entrance to the hillside pen and looked inside. He looked at the cow, at the goats, at the dry floor, at the warm, still air. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You have room for one more?" She looked at him. His face was different than it had been. The hardness was still there, but it was cracked now, like the surface of dry ground after the first rain. "What do you have?" she asked. "A heifer, the last one. She is weak. The barn is gone, and I cannot keep her warm in the lean-to we threw together." She nodded and stepped aside. "Bring her up," she said. He brought the heifer that evening, leading her by a rope, coaxing her step by step up the muddy slope. The animal was thin, her coat matted, her eyes dull. But she walked into the hillside chamber and stood among the goats as though she had always belonged there. Caleb stood at the entrance, his hat in his hands, looking at the walls, at the timber supports, at the drainage channel. He reached out and touched the shale lining, running his fingers over the fitted stones. "How did you know?" he said. His voice was low, almost inaudible. She considered her answer. She could have told him about the hours she had spent watching water move. She could have told him about the first winter in the drafty cabin, when she had pressed her back against the hillside and felt the earth giving back what little warmth it had stored. She could have told him about the mockery, about the widow's whispers, about the laughter that had carried across the cold air and settled in her bones like frost. She did not say any of that. She said, "I did not know. I just watched, and I built what I saw." Caleb stood there a moment longer, then nodded once and walked away without another word. She watched him go, his figure small against the gray landscape, and she understood that something had changed between them that could not be undone. That night the rain turned to sleet, and the sleet turned to snow. The wind rose again, not as fierce as the November storm, but insistent, pushing against the hillside with a steady pressure that made the earth groan. She stayed in the cabin, close to the fire, listening. In the morning she went to the pen. The heifer was standing. The goats were calm. The milk from the cream dough and the brown dough filled 3 pails. She ate a small breakfast of cornmeal mush and went out to see what the valley needed. She found the valley in a state of quiet desperation that was worse than panic. Panic moved people to action. This was the exhaustion that came after the panic had spent itself, the hollow realization that there was no end in sight. The Pratt family had moved into the Hargrove Soddy after their own house was damaged by a second slide. The Petersons were living in a canvas tent, their soddy too wet to inhabit. The trading post was open, but nearly empty of goods. Ezra Trumbull had run out of coffee and sugar and salt, and the flour was down to the last sack. The road would not be passable for wagons for another week, perhaps longer. She did not have enough to feed everyone. She had beans and dried squash and goat milk, and she had a hillside that stayed warm and dry. She could not save the valley alone, but she could keep the most vulnerable animals alive, and she could share what she had with the families who had nowhere else to turn. So that is what she did. She took in the Pedersen widow's surviving chickens, 9 scrawny hens that pecked at the straw in the corner of the pen and laid small, pale eggs. She took in the Hargrove family's remaining goat, a thin doe with a fractured leg that she splinted with strips of bark and cloth. She took in a pig from the Johnsons, a stubborn, muddy creature that refused to be led and had to be carried up the slope in her arms, grunting and squirming, her coat ruined beyond repair. The pig settled in the warmest corner of the chamber and fell asleep within minutes. She stood among the animals, surrounded by bodies and breath and the gentle sounds of survival, and she felt the full weight of what she had done. The hillside that had been a joke was now a refuge. The hole in the ground was a sanctuary. The woman who had been laughed at was the only one in the valley whose animals had not died. That evening, Martha Hargrove came to the cabin with a jar of stew and a folded piece of paper. The stew was from her mother, a gesture that needed no words. The paper was from the county assessor, who had ridden through the pass before the last slide had closed the road. It was a notice of approval for her structure, officially classified as a sod and earth livestock shelter, and recognized as a lawful improvement to her claim. She read it twice, folded it, and placed it on the shelf above the hearth. Martha watched her. "They are still talking," she said. "Some of them. The widow Pedersen says you only helped because you wanted something in return. My father says you have a strange way of doing things, but he stopped saying they were wrong." She shrugged. "I do not know what to tell you. People are slow." She looked at the girl, at her earnest, tired face, and she smiled for the first time in what felt like a very long time. "People are slow," she said, "but the hillside does not wait for them to catch up." That night, she sat by the fire with the last of the coffee and thought about the path that had led her here. She thought about the spade in her hands on that October morning, the first cut into the hillside, the clean, dark smell of the earth. She thought about the laughter that had followed, and the silence that had followed the laughter, and the strange, tentative respect that was beginning to emerge from the silence. She thought about the animals in her care, the warm, breathing weight of them, the responsibility she had accepted without fully understanding where it would lead. She did not know what the spring would bring. She did not know whether the valley would recover, whether the people would remember her help or resent it, whether the hillside shelter would stand for years or collapse under the next winter's weight. She knew only that she had built something true, and that the truth of it had been tested and had not broken. And that, she decided, was enough to keep going. She finished her coffee, banked the fire, and went to check the pen one last time before bed. The animals were settled, the chamber warm, the earth holding its steady patience. She closed the door and stood in the darkness of the tunnel, feeling the weight of the hillside above her. And she knew that whatever came next, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else, with her hands steady, her eyes open, and her trust placed in the ground beneath her feet. But the storm was not finished. The wind had shifted again, and she could feel it pressing against the hillside from a new direction. Something was still moving out there, beyond the reach of her lantern light, and she would need to be ready when it arrived. She did not sleep that night. The wind had shifted to the southeast, bringing a dampness that she recognized from her childhood in Ohio, the kind of air that preceded a long, steady rain. She sat in the chair by the dying fire, her coat still on, her boots still laced, listening to the world outside change. The temperature rose through the small hours, and by midnight the sleet had turned to rain, a steady, drumming rain that fell without pause and without mercy. She went to the door and opened it a crack. The sound of water running was everywhere, not just falling from the sky, but moving across the ground, gathering in streams, cutting new channels through the frozen soil. The hillside above her pen was dark and wet, and she could hear the faint trickle of runoff finding its way into the drainage trench she had dug. She closed the door and stood in the dark, breathing slowly. By dawn, the rain had not stopped. The creek below had risen past its banks and was spreading across the valley floor in a wide brown sheet that covered the road, the fields, the low places where the homestead stood. She pulled on her oilcloth coat and went out to the pen. The animals were restless, the goats pressing together, the cow lowing softly, the pig grunting in its corner. The chamber was dry. The drainage channel was carrying water steadily away from the entrance, emptying it into the trench that ran down the slope. She checked the walls, the ceiling, the timber supports. All sound. She added hay and spoke to the animals in a low voice until they settled. Then she went back out into the rain. She made her way down to the valley floor, picking her path along the high ground, avoiding the gullies that had become streams. The water was ankle-deep on the road, then knee-deep in places, and she had to turn back twice before she found a route that brought her to the Hargrove soddy. The family was on the roof: old Mr. Hargrove, his wife, the 3 younger children, and Martha, all of them sitting on the sod roof with their feet drawn up, the water lapping at the walls below. The door was half submerged. The chickens were gone. She called out, and Mr. Hargrove turned, his face gray with cold and exhaustion. "The creek came up fast," he said. We did not have time to move anything. She waded forward, the water reaching her waist, and helped them down one by one, carrying the youngest child on her shoulders, leading them to the high ground where her cabin stood. She brought them inside, built up the fire, and gave them dry clothes from her meager store. The children huddled by the hearth, shivering. Mrs. Hargrove sat at the table with her head in her hands. Mr. Hargrove stood at the window, staring at the water that was now his home. She went back out. The rain was falling harder now, driven by a wind that had picked up again. She made her way to the Pratt family, who had taken shelter in the old Pearson place, a cabin that sat on slightly higher ground. The water had not reached them yet, but it was coming. She helped them move their remaining possessions to the loft and told them to stay there until the rain stopped. She went to the Peterson tent and found it collapsed, the family huddled under a canvas tarp, soaked and shivering. She led them up the hill to her cabin, crowding the Hargroves further, and built another fire in the stove until the small room was thick with steam and breath. The widow Pedersen was the last. She found her standing on the roof of her chicken coop, the water up to the coop's windows, her thin arms wrapped around a basket of eggs. She was not crying, she was not speaking. She was simply standing there, holding the eggs, as though they were the only thing she had left. The woman waded out to her and held out her hand. "Come," she said, "bring the eggs." The widow looked at her for a long moment, and then she took the hand and stepped down into the water. By afternoon the rain stopped. The clouds broke apart, and a pale, watery sun appeared, casting long shadows across the flooded valley. She stood on the ridge above her cabin and looked down at what had been a settlement. The water was receding, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris. The Hargrove soddy was a brown smear. The Pratt house was half collapsed. The Calloway brothers' barn was a pile of sticks. The trading post was standing, but water had come through the door, and Ezra Trumbull was outside with a bucket, throwing mud into the yard. The hillside shelter was untouched. The water had risen to within 10 feet of the entrance, but the drainage trench had carried the runoff away, and the packed earth had held. She went inside to check the animals. They were alive, all of them. The goats, the cow, the heifer, the pig, the 9 hens, the Hargrove goat with the splinted leg, all standing, all breathing, all warm. She leaned against the shale wall and let herself feel what she had not allowed herself to feel in days. The simple, overwhelming relief of a thing that had not broken. The valley came to her in the days that followed. Not all at once, but in a slow, ragged procession of people who had lost everything except the clothes on their backs. They came to ask for milk, for eggs, for a warm place to sleep, for news of their neighbors. She gave what she had, and when she ran out, she gave what she could spare from the animals. And when that ran low, she gave her time and her labor, helping to dig out cellars, to salvage timber, to bury the animals that had not survived. She did not count the cost. She did not keep a ledger. She simply did what was in front of her, the same way she had built the shelter, one task at a time, with steady hands and a quiet heart. On the 5th day after the flood, a group of settlers gathered at the trading post. Ezra Trumbull had managed to get a wagon through the pass, and there was coffee again, and sugar and flour. She was there, standing by the counter, when the widow Pedersen walked in. The widow looked different, older, thinner, her eyes holding a light that was no longer sharp but had softened into something else. She walked across the room, past the men who had laughed, past the women who had whispered, and she stopped directly in front of the woman. The room went quiet. The widow looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the post, "Sarah, I was wrong." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The name hung in the air like a bell that had been struck and was still ringing. Sarah. No one in the valley had called her by her name in months. She had been the woman with the goats, the woman with the hole in the hill, the woman who lived like a groundhog. But the widow had said her name, and in saying it, she had given back something that had been taken without permission. Caleb Calloway stepped forward. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it in a slow circle. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I laughed at you. I made jokes. And when my heifer was dying, you took her in, and you saved her. I do not know how to repay that." She looked at him, and she felt the weight of all the words she had never said. The mornings of digging alone, the evenings of mending in silence, the laughter that had cut deeper than any blade because it came from people who did not know her and had not tried. But she had not built the shelter for their approval. She had built it because the goats needed a warm place, and the hillside had offered one. "You do not owe me anything," she said. "Keep the heifer, keep her warm. That is enough." Caleb nodded, and the room seemed to exhale. The weeks that followed were slow and difficult. The valley rebuilt, piece by piece, with the cautious hope of people who had learned that the ground could not be trusted without understanding it first. Sarah's hillside shelter became a quiet landmark, a place where people came to ask questions about drainage and ventilation and the way the earth held its temperature. She answered them all, patient and thorough, showing them the shale lining, the timber supports, the angled channels that carried water away. She did not lecture. She did not remind them of what they had said. She simply showed them what she had learned and let them draw their own conclusions. The cream doe gave birth to twins in early March, a buck and a doe, both healthy and strong. The heifer that Caleb Calloway had brought up the hill had recovered fully and was due to calf in the spring. The pig had grown fat and was returned to the Johnsons, who paid her with 2 sacks of cornmeal and a jar of honey. 9 hens laid eggs every morning, and the milk from the goats and the cow filled a crock that she shared with the Hargroves, the Pratts, and the widow Pedersen, who came by every 3rd day with a clean pail and a quiet word of thanks. Sarah stood on the hillside one evening in late March, watching the sun set over the valley. The snow was gone, and the grass was beginning to green along the creek bottom. The mud had dried, and the roads were passable again. Her cabin needed new chinking. The pen needed a second chamber for the growing herd. The fence line had rotted in 3 places and would need replacing before summer. The work was never finished. It would never be finished. That was not a burden. It was a promise. She walked down to the pen and opened the door. The goats looked up, their eyes calm and steady. The cream doe came forward, her twins stumbling behind her, and pressed her warm nose against Sarah's hand. She stood there in the dim light, surrounded by the slow, patient breathing of the earth she had trusted. And she understood that the story was not about the shelter, or the storm, or the mockery she had endured. It was about a woman who had looked at a hillside and seen something no one else could see, and who had built it anyway, not for recognition, but because it was true. She closed the door, latched it, and walked back up to the cabin as the first stars appeared over the ridge. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.